for hosting this podcast for us, because without you, obviously, this would not be possible. So thank you so much. And welcome, everyone. Mai, thanks for joining us today. And it looks like they're with Lori. I said hi, and Cheryl, hi. And we have a special guest today. I'm really excited to bring this person to you today. This is Lisa. And Lisa, I know I'm going to mispronounce your last name, so I'm just not going to try. So I'm just going to wait until you introduce yourself. But Lisa and I talked when I made a call out to bring on other professional counselors to the podcast. And I had mentioned this a few podcasts ago about doing so. And Lisa was one of the people that responded to that. And so she and I chatted, and she's got just such a dynamic energy, and she's like kindred. I mean, we just like hit it off so amazingly well. And so I'm excited to bring her. So Lisa, I'm going to allow you to introduce yourself. On the screen, you could see a little information about her background. I mean, she's got such an interesting background, and I'm going to just shut my mouth now because otherwise I'll keep talking because I'm so excited that you're here. So.
Well, thank you, Serena, and thank you for having me. And hello to, is it Pramila and Lori? Okay, nice to meet you both. My last name is Aranis. I don't like talking about myself, so there you have it. It's all up there on the screen. All my stuff.
All your stuff, all your professional stuff. Well, I can always ask you questions if you want to go into that.
But that's perfect.
All right. Well, let's do that. So, one of the main things, as I mentioned before with the podcast, that a lot of times people kind of see us counselors as, these, we have our crap together kind of things. And we're humans too, right? And so there's like this balance that we also, kind of struggle between the personal and the professional and whatnot, but how did you end up getting into the field of counseling?
Well, I would say if you back up in time when I was a wee little girl, I feel like I always had this interest to help people. And that was twofold. It was either through justice, so legal system, or psychology. And when I say young, I mean, I had a thing about fairness, and I had a thing about wanting to help people, which is fast forward in the future, how I ended up getting the law degree. That's one of them.
Mm.
And then through that experience, when I went through law, I realized it was actually not about fairness. So I, floated around for a little bit, ended up at Metropolitan Life Insurance, had to read a book, 7 Habits of Very Effective People. Mm. And in the first chapter, I believe it was, you're at a funeral, 4 people are going to say something about your life. I think it's a colleague, a friend, a family member, and someone in your community. And you realize that the deceased person is yourself. What do you want them to say about your life? And like, oh, well, she sold insurance and financial products. Like, oh, nope. She helped people find happiness and joy. Yes. And that just sparked it. So then I literally the next day, I started researching, degrees. What can I do to get in front of people? So then I went ahead and got my master's in counseling degree. And fast forward, I've sort of married those two because at the end of the day, the name of my business is Empowered and Authentic Living. And I now recognize that the idea of fairness and equality is so tied to helping people and empowering people. So now this is my passion.
Yeah. And I mean, what a great name too for an organization, because I remember when I first read that, I was like, oh, I like that. Authentic and empowered. Like it just sounds so strong, like, kind of thing. And they're also very connecting, like you said, they connect with each other, but they're very spiritual and they're very realistic too, as well. And so, can you kind of explain a little bit about how you might navigate that, from both ends of the spectrum? Like what might that look like for people realistically in their lives? And then also kind of from a a more spiritual kind of perspective, what that might look like.
Can you clarify your question when you said, what would that look like? What's the that?
Yeah, like, what does it look like to be authentic in
Ah,
reality, right? What does it look like to be empowered in reality? Because, also having, a background in law too. I mean, that's a very unique perspective that you bring to the table with it as well.
sure. Thanks for the question. And a little funny story. I'm not even sure how we came up. When I say we, when I started this business, it was with another person. Her name is Anna. And somehow we came up with empowered and authentic. It meant something to us. But then we did this whole astrological reading our natal charts, sort of for fun. And apparently my chart or her chart was all about being empowered, and the other one's chart was all about being authentic. It was
Oh, wow.
fascinating. So I had a concept of, being empowered and authentic, just being real. And this business started in 2019, I think is when we began the business. But I had a spiritual awakening in 2018, which really changed sort of how I saw people and helping people and the purpose and the point of life. It just cast a completely different context. So today, my idea about empowered and authentic is different than whatever my idea was in 2019. To be honest, I don't even know what I was thinking then, but I know what it means now. So being empowered requires you to be authentic.
Yeah.
They go very much hand in hand. And so it is allowing yourself, giving yourself the freedom to do and be what you want to do and become what you want to be. That's the empowered. Nothing holds you down. You don't live in a box. You're not stifled by the messages in society. But it goes hand in hand with being authentic, because if you don't know your true you, then it's really hard to be your most empowered self.
Yeah, well, that's great. So kind of like your own truth.
Correct.
Yeah. And so knowing your own truth is really, that's that authenticity is what
Yeah.
I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And that allows you then to lead an empowered life because you know it's right for you and all that. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So, talk a little bit about how do you help individuals with, we talk about like not, you mentioned not being conditioned by like society with some of that and whatnot, but the real world, as we like to put it sometimes, has a lot of limits.
Yes.
Right. So, some people may have jobs that have limitations, or, they may have medical conditions, for example, that, they may not get accommodations for, or whatever the case may be. So how do you like work with individuals to help navigate? Because if we're helping, and I agree with you. I mean, I like to think that I help individuals with the same kind of thing. And, but how do you navigate, empowerment with that? Like, because it could be frustrating.
Yeah, it's a great question. I have to say one of the biggest holdbacks is money business, and we are tied to our work because we need to make money in order to pay the bills, and then that's not enough because we have to worry. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. We have to worry about our healthcare in the future, our retirement in the future. So I actually came up with a quote today. I was talking to somebody, and I think I wrote, we lose our freedom in our attempt to find freedom.
Mm. Oh, wow. I like that.
Right?
Yeah, that sounds so true. It's so paradox.
It is. And so this is what we do. We smush ourselves. This is what we have to do
Mm.
in order to get to this, situation that we want to have in the future. Now, it is true, there are limitations. Not everybody has equal access to the same opportunities, etc. I'm going to park those people for a second, because then there's a whole other host of people that are stuck in situations that they don't want to be, only because of that programming.
Mm.
right? That you have to be this or you have to be that, or you're not going to be good at such and such. So fear-based keeps ourselves in this little tiny box. And so in this process of becoming authentic, which is who is the real you? What is it that you actually really, really want? And then help them break through the barriers from the messaging of why you can't or shouldn't or won't be successful going for what you really want. As they start to do that, they will start to make some changes in their life, which is actually more in alignment with what they really want to do. And this is where you find the happy joy part. So that's a group of people. And, I can use myself as an example, when I left, where I was prior to opening up this practice. I mean, for sure there was fear, right? Like that was an established practice. I didn't have to worry about clients coming in and then, okay, move over. Well, are my clients going to follow me? And then what happens when they finish? Am I going to get new clients? How is that all going to work? But at the same time, if I didn't make this move, I wouldn't be doing which I absolutely love. And so there's parts of me that it's about moving past that fear to do what feels right for you. And that's the empowering part.
Oh my goodness, yes. And that's such a great piece right there is, how that fear keeps us stuck.
Yes.
And I can also relate part of my story with that as well, because, I've always wanted to write and I always had that fear of, oh, I'm not a good writer and nobody's going to read my stuff anyways. And, it's always been like this big goal of mine to write. And like you, and we had shared this, I had some spiritual experiences too, where I feel more comfortable doing so. And that's an ultimate, like I'm working towards that now. But
Mm,
so that's it's not as big of a fear that has kept me stuck. And so I see what you're saying in terms of it's not as limiting
right.
anymore, right? And that's what you're kind of talking about. And so people, but like what you said, it's kind of facilitating that, how do we get all these messages about that are fear-based. And a lot of it also comes from people that we care about, that are also, because of their experiences, right? That they're also don't want us to be harmed or hurt or experience what they may have
Right.
experienced,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um, and so, I know that I've experienced this. I know you have. I know we talked about this. Yet at the same time, especially in a culture, where we come from, where there are limitations or messages that we get as women,
Yeah.
or, as a certain ethnic background, or because of a physical limitation or whatever, that it kind of conditions us to believe something. Those are all fear-based kind of messages. And
Mhm.
so, how do you kind of navigate that? Because those are really big programming pieces.
Yeah. So it's a great question. They're big programming and they're deep.
Yeah, and they're deep.
They're deep.
Yeah.
So, you know, consciously, I always say to people on a first session, always, no matter why people come in, there's always the core problem is I'm not good enough the way I am.
Mm,
Always. And I can convince anybody in first session that everybody is good and valuable and important and matter just because they exist
hmm
by asking about other people. And then I'll say to them, so isn't the same true for you too?
right.
Well, yes, it is. Why? Because I exist. Great. We're done. That's over, right? But it's not that easy because
Right.
we can say these things cognitively, but because it is so deeply embedded in who we are,
Yeah.
right? We don't get just to rewrite that story. So really the work then becomes getting into that deep stuff. So, it's the inner child healing that we have to get to. And so, I think there are different modalities that
Right.
are helpful to going towards that. I like to use some version of somatic therapy where you really get the body involved. Parts therapy, I think, is also a great way to get to that as well. But I don't know of any other way to truly get to healing and moving those limiting beliefs unless you go back into where they started from the beginning. And I want to be really clear. Some people will say, well, the past is gone. What does that matter? But you really can. I mean, I could just tell you story after story. You really can go backwards in time and heal those wounds, which then takes you on a completely different trajectory of life, because our behavior on the surface is directly related to the wounds you have that you don't even know you have.
Yeah, no, that is so true. I mean, it's like kind of like a volcano, like you have the lava, the molten in the center, and
Right.
it just kind of, fizzes up into the surface, and it affects every level, that it goes until it explodes. And it's like,
Absolutely.
yeah, it kind of works that way in human beings too. So, you want to deal with that lava first
Right.
before it explodes, kind of a thing. Yeah.
Right.
You
Right.
mentioned the word healing. So I'm a little curious about, how you see the difference between healing and like coping with things.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then remind me to go back to the other situation where people truly are limited, because I do want to address that, because that is a
Okay.
reality. So coping to me is, I have this bad situation and how can I find a way to deal with it or cope with it? And then we have good coping skills, bad coping skills. Bad ones, I'm going to drink, I'm going to sleep, I'm going to go shop crazy, right? Those are the negative coping skills, and, all the way to self-harm. Healing to me is, you don't even have to experience the distress that you're having. So therefore, you don't even need to cope with it. So healing,
Oh.
right? It rids you of the problem.
Okay, yeah, that's a great way of putting it. So it's kind of like you don't have the residuals of this experience
Or
where,
you're not having to deal with, right? Yes.
yeah, like there isn't any,
You've solved the problem, in other words.
yeah, like you're not dealing with all the after effects of whatever that was.
Right.
Whereas with coping, you still have kind of like those residuals or the after effects that have
Right.
not been dealt with.
Right. So, great example, for typical people come in with depression and anxiety.
Right.
Right. And so what do we have? Medications. That's one. And then, we can do some work about, why are you struggling with depressive symptoms right now, or why are you anxious right now? But I think, right, most people aren't just born and they come out, I'm depressed, and they come out, I'm anxious. They come out with relatively a blank slate. I don't want to go too deep into, but there's
Yeah.
still harm that can be done when you're in the womb. But you come out, and then life experiences occur, and then whatever
Right.
your predisposition is, whether it's alcoholism, physical, cardiac issues, or mental health issues, eventually those will pop out, and there will be something in life that has created, the symptoms to finally surface enough. And so, what I'm looking at is, let's go back in time to see how you even got set up, right? To end up in situations where you're now depressed. And ultimately, what has happened is you've been disempowered throughout your life,
Mm.
which creates the anxiety, trying to have control, trying to predict what's going to happen, how am I going to be okay? And the depression, of course, is, my life isn't the way I would like it to be. Well, why not? Again, because you were disempowered from back here.
Yeah.
Healing is, like I said, you go back here and you, again, it sounds weird to say it, but you actually re-empower where you were disempowered
Yeah.
there in time.
Yeah, and that's interesting you say that, because I know when I have worked with clients too, and do exactly what you're talking about, they're like, "You want me to do what?
Yeah, right. The
You
person's
want
gone.
you want me to do what?" And I'm like, "Well, let's just try it and see what
Yeah,
happens, and but we'll just see." And it's kind of, because it doesn't make sense, right, in the present moment, and yet at the same time, it could be a very powerful experience for the person,
yeah,
depending on timing and whatnot, and as
right,
counselors, sometimes, that's how we're trained, right, is timing.
right.
So, the other piece too, I just wanted to kind of come back, is that you're kind of, what I'm hearing you say is like kind of like a blueprint. You're kind of looking at the blueprint of a person and
Yeah,
how it sets them up to be disempowered in their life, and how it manifests these kind of symptoms that kind of, collide to create this unhappiness, or disauthentic, unauthentic. I'm not sure what the right word is there, the
in
correct
authentic.
English. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, whatever the word
It
is
is
there for,
on out.
yeah, just not being authentic. That's the word. And not feeling empowered, and then being able to kind of look at, okay, well, let's, like what you said, just kind of backtrack and look at, these experiences that kind of set that up. So leading into, you wanted me to bring it back to this group of individuals that do have these limits, that you talked about earlier. Did you want
Yeah,
to come back to that?
yeah, I did. So, there is a reality.
Yeah.
And so for those, I really do want to help them control what they can.
Yeah.
And so, yes, there are certain things that have to be, but even in that group of individuals, there is way more joy that they can have in their life, even with just the little things, even if it's, hey, appreciate the fact that you do have a roof over your head, appreciate the fact that, you have this now. And hey, wow, look at that. You at least can have however it works out, you're actually available to, have the opportunity to talk to a therapist, right? And try to find a better space. So even just, finding the things to be grateful for, I think can be tremendously helpful. And as you're talking, on my screen is this big bullet about what does spirituality mean to you? And I'm like, oh, I got to bring this in now. Um, I've used spirituality for those who are inclined, to help people move away from all this bad stuff happened to me. Right.
Yeah.
So eventually, when we get into a whole spiritual conversation, I'll start asking people, well, what does spirituality mean to you? And what's the path about? And it's really fascinating because most people actually don't have a clear sense.
Mm.
Um, but I think they all have this desire to be on it. Like there's this innate pull towards it, even though they're not sure what that means. So essentially, I talk about it being a path to self-love, which is self-acceptance. And in that self-love, then you can, as you learn to self-love and self-accept, you automatically start to love other or accept others just because they're a human being, because you understand now what happened to you. You recognize, oh, wounded people wound people, wounded people hurt people. So now you have more compassion and grace and understanding. That's a sign. However, everybody can say, yes, the soul exists forever. And they can all go, but then people start to fall apart. Well, what happens when I die? Like, well, I go, but the soul exists forever, right? So, what are we just hanging out?
Right. Like, what is there, like a coffee shop I'm going
I
to
know. What
or
are we all
something?
doing? So, I can, slowly present the idea of like, well, I don't know, whatever you're doing, your soul's in this particular body right now, right? Okay. So why is it here? What does it want to do? It's here to learn love and acceptance. And then we talk about, well, how do you know what that really means and what that would feel like unless you've experienced the opposite?
Mm. Oh,
Right.
yeah.
Right. So can you imagine? And I can even talk from my own experience. Like I've experienced these moments of just this amazing love and amazing peace. And like, well, I only know that's so amazing because I've had the opposite of that.
Right.
Right. And it's like, oh, I want this. And so I suggest that as a soul, we're here for one person, one purpose and one purpose only. And that is the whole love and acceptance, etc., and coming to oneness. And so imagine that you chose to come into the circumstances you came into so that you can experience all of this. And so what I do is I take their lifetime and use it more as this is an experience for your soul to grow that potentially you probably chose, because if you believe in a God, you believe, right, that God is here for good reasons and God doesn't do bad things just for bad, right?
Right, right,
So you get the buy-ins. And so then it shifts people away from, man, I was the victim of my mother, my father, my grandfather, whatever.
right.
And oh, so I'm here and I chose this for me to have these experiences. And it really opens up a perspective and it helps people move away from that sort of this thing was done to me, and we start talking about, no, this was for me.
Oh, that's a very interesting way of putting it, that it was instead of being done to me, it was for me.
Hmm.
That just that one change of wording can really shift a perspective for people.
Hugely.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And what came to mind when you were talking about that, it reminds me of there's a book, Clarissa, oh, I'm gonna forget her name, Dr. Clarissa Estes. Oh, she wrote the book Women Who Run with Wolves. It
Ah,
won like
familiar with the
yeah,
title.
you know what I'm talking about. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So she wrote this book and she's I don't remember the culture that she's from. Amazing book though, but one story that's in there that always comes to mind is, there's a story about, how this is paraphrasing, of course, about how the baby was dropped at the wrong place. And the when the child was growing up, they were so different from their family, they didn't understand what was going on. And so the story talks about how, maybe they were brought to this family for different reasons,
Mm.
by it wasn't a mistake, it was a lesson. And
Yeah.
so it was meant to teach the family as well, and not just the child, as the child grew into an
Yes.
adult. And I
Yes.
was like, wow, that's a really interesting way of looking at this experience, if you're coming at it from the spiritual kind of existential perspective, and some people may not, come from that perspective. But I do think that, what you were saying is that it kind of addresses that question of why, why,
Right. Yes.
right? And people love that question,
Yeah.
why?
Yeah.
And I don't like that question. I I try to stay away from that question. It's like, no, there could be 50 million reasons why.
Oh,
Let's
I embrace that question.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. I appreciate that. I do. I'm like, there could be 50 million reasons why. Let's focus on what and how.
Ah, well, I embrace it because I think people like to be able to make sense of stuff that
Agreed.
not
Okay,
good.
agreed. Hmm.
And by the time they reach to me, they usually have I can almost ask them, what are you passionate about? And they'll say, oh, well, I don't know. But as you talk a little more, you'll hear it, you find it. And then I can always tie it back to the life circumstances they went through.
Ah, okay.
I am like, so do you think that one of the reasons why you're so passionate about wanting to do this, or this is because of the experiences you had back here? Yeah.
Okay.
So, or even people who make, quote, poor, this is a little different scenario, but it helps people who make poor choices. Like, I drank, now I can't stand myself because I drank and blah, blah, blah. And I said, oh my gosh, do you understand why? Why? Because I was just a bad person. I'm like, no, because you loved yourself so much that you wanted out of the pain that you were experiencing. So that was one way you learned to sort of just dull that pain. And hey, good for you, because now you've landed here, right? Because it got you through that time period. Now you're here. And guess what? Now we get to move you in a different direction. But that served a purpose, right? So everything
Right.
that you go through, I tie it to how it has helped you and
Yeah.
bring you towards this ultimate whatever your soul is here for.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. It's very much purpose driven, that
Yes.
there is a purpose to even maladaptive negative behaviors, that there's a reason you're doing it. And it's not about judging it or blaming it on quote unquote bad character, things like that. It's like, well, there's a reason for it, and recognizing that there's a complex interplay of lots of factors. It's not just, this kind of a thing, like what you talked about before. And I like, I really appreciate your explanation of the why question because, as someone who tries to not utilize the why question, um, I don't, approach it more from, I mean, that's what I use with the what and the how, because it's very gestalt. And so
Uh,
it's like, I use the same kind of thing, but I ask more like, well, what does this relate to in your history?
yeah.
What comes up when you think about this, that you've experienced before, kind of a thing. Let's
Yeah.
let's see if there's a connection. Let's connect
Yeah.
some dots here for you.
Yeah.
So it's kind of really framing it too, like what you're saying from a different perspective in a way that's very, okay, this is your experience. And
But it states in a way that's very empowering.
oh, there you go. Touche. Okay. Yeah, it's very empowering. I mean, and again, it's like, these are your experiences, and who am I to judge them or to tell you what they're about, because they're not my experiences, right? And just like when people try to tell me about my experiences, I'm like, look, unless you walked in my shoes,
Mhm.
I mean, you cannot tell me what I'm feeling or what's valid and what's not valid. It's like, I
Right.
know what I went through,
That's
right?
right. Yep.
Oh, and yeah. So, as a human being, not even a professional, but just as a human, it's like, oh my goodness, like, how do you, sometimes I just don't understand that whole thing. So I do want to ask this other question about how you, as a professional and as a human, how do you find that balance between the two? Because it sounds like, the approach that you take, there are spiritual elements to it. There's also very real elements, realistic elements to it. And so there is this kind of pendulum that you balance. But in your, personally, because we're also looking at the person, not just the therapist, or I'm sorry, the counselor. But how
Right.
do you kind of balance that for yourself?
So great question. That whole other piece is hilarious, the authenticity.
Yeah.
Okay, let me back up. Um, when I went through my own healing process,
Uh-huh.
the somatic work, I remember the therapist saying something about, it's just about being authentic and just being yourself. And then I started getting confused. I said, but hang on, as a counselor, you play a role and you're the da, 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 da. And then when you're in your personal life, you're just you. And she said, well, don't worry about it. And I go, what do you mean? She goes, just don't worry about it. It'll all sort itself out. And so here's what happened. As I started to lose my own limiting beliefs and fears and whatnot, and became more authentic, I just
Yeah.
to be the same me wherever I show up.
Okay.
Right? So as a therapist, I'm still me. This that you see right here is often the same energy I have in my session. Now, I'll match sometimes their energy, of course. And so what I do is I will share, I think you and I talked about this, I will share my personal experiences as it relates to theirs, because I do want them to see that I'm a human being. I do want them to know that I've gone through similar struggles.
Right.
Again, like you said, you walk in your own shoes, you can relate, but everybody has their own way of experiencing something. But I
Right.
think it's so important for our clients to not just put a counselor up on the pedestal and go, well, you got it all together.
Right. Yeah.
Well,
No.
oh shit, man, it took me to get here. You know,
Yeah, still a work in progress.
technically have it all together. So I do share, and sometimes I've always found, I shouldn't say always, somewhere around 2019, I started to recognize that the personal experiences that I was having always somehow was helpful for somebody else. And
Mhm.
I'm always ahead. And the closest I've come to is a day when I had the experience this day, sorted it out, and the next day someone came in with, and I'm like, oh, okay. So this helps me, when that everything is happening for me. That's one thing I know, because I'm so passionate about helping people, that I know that every challenge that I have is not only for my own growth, but I know that I'm going
Mm.
to pass that on to someone else. And it makes it all okay, good.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah. And on that note, because we are out of time, and I apologize, we went a little bit over, but I do have your contact information up in case people want to check out your website or contact you, or just kind of, get to know a little bit more about you and your work. But it does remind me something that I read, that when, you start seeing more coincidences, it lets you know that you're on the right path. And I'm
Yes.
just like, darn it. Like, apparently I'm on the right path because it's like, it's like finally, you know.
You're
So
hanging on to the ride.
right, yeah, it's so Lisa, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. You have definitely made this a great time. Thank you so much for bringing your knowledge and your wisdom and your humor. Thank you everybody for joining us this evening. And if you have any questions or comments, please, do include them on the chat or in the chat box or, in Facebook if you're there, or you can add them in the YouTube, and we will see you all in 2 weeks.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
Appreciate
Thanks.
it.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Serena.